Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Starstruck. I'm building quite a lot actually, as you can see on the screen. I built a total of 14 modules and the footage is going by so fast that I can't even talk about each one. I believe it was sped up by about 40 times. Right now, I'm building a drill which is going to be used in our crater mining endeavors. And the module I was building before this one was a communications module. Now, you may notice that these modules are quite a fair bit more complex than the ones I was building beforehand. And I will admit, I built some pretty basic stuff in the last episode and it wasn't really representative of what I actually do. So I just wanted to bring the level of complexity for the build up for this episode and for future ones. There I spent a bit of time working on a rover, which will aid us in transporting materials from the mining outcrop to the main storage tanks on the base. Constructing a little garage for the rover will protect it from harsh conditions on the moon, and the air and storage tanks below will help us when processing the material we get from mining. I'm making 2 small drones and 1 large drone to aid in transporting modules over the lunar surface, and speaking from experience with past bases, these are definitely going to be a big help. Moving on from the drones, I'm going to be constructing a launch and landing pad which will serve as a dedicated place for new modules to arrive and take off from. Zooming out, you can really get a feel for just how much volume we're going to be adding to the base in the next few launches. Now, putting together the fairing will give me a good sense of just how dense I need to make the payload. Initially, I planned to fit all the modules I had just built into one fairing, but I knew it wasn't going to work out after I saw just how much space was left with only 2 modules in the fairing. So I just took the losses and split it up into multiple launches. I tried my hardest to get this rover in the fairing, but eventually gave up and just switched to another module. I did mention in our last episode that I didn't have any plan to get the payload down to the surface. I could get away with this pretty easily at the time because I was working with relatively small modules. However, these modules were clearly too big and their height too high for them to just drop down onto the surface, so I did end up making an actual system to get them on the ground. I wasn't able to record me building it, however you will see it in action later on. Making final adjustments to the modules will conclude our payload integration for our first launch. I'll be using our Days and Nights cycle pack that the EarthOverhaul team and I have worked on. These don't make any changes to the stock solar system properties, so they're safe to use for our purposes. A wonderful liftoff, and we're not going to spend too much time looking at our path to orbit, but I did include this sped up clip so that you can really see how beautiful these colors are. With such a large payload, it proved surprisingly hard to get to orbit. Unfortunate as it is, I actually ended up re-entering the atmosphere before fully getting to orbit. This was due to the relatively low thrust-to-weight ratio of my stages. Having a more fine-tuned thrust-to-weight ratio for all the stages would have been better, but there wasn't much I could do about it anyway for this launch. I'm sure if I were a launch provider, no one would choose me unless they wanted their payload to be absolutely destroyed. After what seemed like ages, the trajectory line finally appeared behind me and I hastily raised my orbit. You'll notice I'm pointing almost directly perpendicular to the Earth's surface, which is not good considering my height. I time warped through the upper atmosphere just to get to my apoapsis, then burned prograde for just a bit until I got my final push to orbit. Skipping over the boring details, I used the rest of my fuel in my second stage for the translunar injection, and then separated my lander, so I could do one final burn before a coast phase just to get my trajectory in the right place for the moon. Just getting those last meters per second of delta V's for our encounter. Once we do that, we're going to make some fine-tuning adjustments. And here we're setting our periapsis for the moon at about 60 kilometers. Once we have that set, we're now officially in our coast phase, and this is where we deploy the landing legs. These are just some simple strut legs which undock and redock to the craft. I did have some trouble while accidentally clicking those parachutes. And when we finally have those in place, we'll just time warp right over to our periapsis. Those legs are just one of the cool mechanisms which I wanted to put on the lander. Nothing too special to see here, just a lunar insertion burn while we're pointing retrograde. And this is real time, I actually do turn that fast because of how many probes I have in the payload. It's also probably why I didn't have to spend as much time looking at the balance of the payload itself, considering that the center of mass looked very off-center. lowering our orbit till it's right above the base, that way we can prepare for a nice smooth landing. Just going to time warp till we're roughly at our periapsis, then we can point retrograde using the power of our probes, and do a final burn to target us for our landing. We did end up getting the low moon orbit achievement, which is a nice plus. And there, just seeing our periapsis come into view as we target our final landing spot, right next to the base. Final approach just a couple thousand meters above the surface. With the thrust to weight ratio of only 2 frontiers, we can barely slow ourselves down. However, we do end up making it, cutting it perhaps a little bit too close. Using those custom landing legs, we'll be touching down gently on the surface of the moon. Looks like they did their job well, and we've had a nice touchdown. And zooming out shows the base on our far left. Oh yeah, and we launched another one. Now, let's start the setup of the payload from our first launch. About those systems I mentioned a while ago which would help us get the payload on the ground, they're actually these little extendable ramps. Once they're on the ground, they'll make for an easy way to get our payloads down safely. I detach our launch pad from the main structure or spine of the lander, then skid it down to the surface. After that, since I packed the launch pad itself with probes, it was easy to just roll the launch pad onto our designated area. I placed it relatively far from the base itself, that way it would be realistic since any dust or debris picked up from the engines at launch or liftoff would stay far away from the base. Here you can see the drones really being utilized. They're going to be our main source of propulsion for moving these modules around. The large drone can barely lift up some of our heavier modules. Setting down the communications module will lay out the groundwork for our base. And I had to cover quite a lot of distance with just this small drone. I'm definitely glad I used ion engines, otherwise I would not have been able to get this capability out of such a small craft. Speaking of the craft itself, I use the ion engines primarily for thrust, while the RCS is used only when necessary for maneuvering. Comparing the efficiencies of each engine, the ion is literally 10 times more efficient than the RCS, so it would make sense that I use it. In some cases though, the ion engines are not pointed in the right direction for them to be used, so I use the RCS for that instead, like you just saw me do earlier with the mining storage dock. Now, I'm transporting the storage tanks themselves. You can see I'm having a bit of a hard time trying to dock with this tank specifically, since I didn't put it in exactly the ideal position in the blueprint. Nevertheless, I'm able to dock to it and promptly put it onto its base. This will be the start of our mining endeavor. With the first tank in place, I head back over to our first lander. However, as I look closely, I notice a big problem. I had accidentally attached the side parachute on the drill to the side of the tank. This means I'm not able to detach the tank from the drill. As you can tell from my frantic movements on the screen, I was in a bit of a pickle. So I decided to detach all of the other modules just to see what I'm working with. I end up bringing the module that the drones will dock to down and rolling it back over the launch pad. You'll see later that this was not the first of my problems. While rolling the launch pad, I was being a bit too ambitious and ended up breaking apart on it, so I just consider that a lost cause and head back to the lander. I tried detaching one of the ports but didn't know that it would end up breaking the ramp entirely. So I had that going for me in addition to all of these problems. After that incident, I just try and take the drill and the fuel tank off. But I have barely enough thrust to weight ratio to lift off and end up snagging the launch pad. Lucky for me, this didn't break any parts, but served as a reminder that I should be more careful. Spoiler alert, I may or may not have kept that in mind. After hopping over our second lander, I gracefully smash into the surface and come to a stop right next to our storage tanks. Now while I was here, I was thinking to myself, how am I going to get these separated? And considering I had a lot of experience messing things up in the build screen and only noticing them after I've sent them on a mission, it really hits close to home. So I have the idea. Since I know that I have to break that side parachute to get them apart, and I know that some parts in SFS are stronger than others, I grab a structural part. or a strut. This is actually the one I broke off while spinning my launch pad around, which is a bit ironic. Armed with a strut and a will to destroy, I have to be careful with what I do here, because I do not want to break the wrong part. I have to be very precise and calculated. With only my probe torque and my engines to control me, I am having quite a hard time trying to break this one part. After a couple of attempts, I do end up breaking the small fuel tank on the drill. After that, I try a couple times to break the assorted parts I need to break before I can get to the side parachute connecting the two. This was actually pretty intense for me, but due to some sheer luck or whatever, I end up breaking 3 parts in a row. It looks like a carnival game now that I look back at it. After finally being able to separate the drill and the tank, I throw away the strut. With that away, it won't be bothering me for the time being. Now, with them actually separated, I now had another problem. I needed to figure out how I was actually going to get the tank onto the base. Since the drone has the RCS sticking out on the side of it, I couldn't just pick it up on the ground. So, I had to actually take the base to the tank, and then dock it. You'll see what I'm talking about here in a moment. It seems kind of like a game of Tetris to me, now that I think about it. I even nearly broke an RCS while going down, as they're the most fragile parts in the game, along with solar panels. With the final tank in place, I was just barely able to lift the entire assembly up, using both my engines and RCS. At the time, I thought my problems were over, but still I had some more to go. Here, I tried to get some fuel from the first lander, as I was running dangerously low. However, it seemed like there was no easy way to actually dock to it so I could transfer the fuel, so I just moved to the second lander. Once I was there, I got my fuel fill, then after that did a couple more fuel transfers. After fixing that up, I took a trip to our mining storage to fully fill those tanks. Having a bit of trouble controlling these drones, they're not easy to handle. Then, I pushed the drill and the storage tanks apart, because I'm planning to put a module between those. After doing so, I grabbed the remaining module from the first lander, which is that little drone dock that I rolled over, and then bring it back over to the base. I was just about to touch it down when this strut with a docking port came back to haunt me, and then I swatted it like a fly. With all the modules from our first launch done, I head over to the second lander. I did just a bit more fuel transfer before deploying those ramps, then got to work by transporting this first tank over to the drone dock where it can refuel other drones. I overshot the docking port a bit on this one, and these drones are actually pretty hard to control considering that I only have a probe and no engine gimbal. Now, remember what I said about the drill only being the first of my problems? For some reason, I was not able to detach the port between these two tanks. In my defense, this really should have worked. I have no idea why they ended up connecting like this. But I guess it is my fault for not testing payload deployment on Earth before launching. If you look at the top right hand corner, you can see I can barely change my velocity with the mass of these two tanks. Combined with the center of mass and the center of thrust not being aligned, this made it very hard to control. Since I just was not able to detach those tanks, I rolled over the communications module since it was just asking for it. Thinking ahead, I also placed these tanks on the far right hand docking port. This should make it easier for me when I do figure out how to separate these. It'll either be one of those part destroying maneuvers or I'm gonna have to completely redo the launch. At this point I'm feeling pretty defeated. I couldn't separate these two tanks and I had problems separating the drill in another tank. Little did I know I was not able to separate these tanks either. Many modules were broken and I just did not know what to do. I'll see you next time and hopefully figure out how to deal with this.